The woman at the door said it without looking up. This entrance is for members and their guests. The service entrance is around the back. She said it the way people say things they've rehearsed. So many times the words no longer carry weight. Automatic, bored, efficient. The kind of sentence that expects no argument. Nadine Achebe did not argue. She stood for a moment in the entrance of the Harborview Club, the Lake Ontario wind pressing cold against the back of her coat, and she looked at the woman behind the reception desk. Young, blonde, wearing the club's navy blazer with the gold crest on the breast pocket, and she said, very quietly, "I have a reservation, under Achebe." The woman typed something, looked at the screen, typed again, "I don't see it. Try NovaSpark Capital." A pause. The woman's fingers stopped moving. Something shifted in her face. Not apology, not yet. More like recalibration. "One moment, please." Nadine waited. She had spent 38 years learning how to wait. She had waited in line at the food bank on Dufferin Street when she was 9 years old, holding her mother's hand and staring at the ground so she wouldn't have to meet anyone's eyes. She had waited in the lobby of a venture capital firm on Bay Street at 26, the only black woman among 11 candidates, while the receptionist called her name wrong twice, and then asked if she was sure she was in the right building. She had waited outside a hospital room at 41, while the doctors told her things she already knew in her bones. Waiting was something Nadine Achebe knew how to do. She had built an entire company on the kind of patience that other people mistook for passivity. The Harborview Club annual gala was one of the most reliably predictable events on the Toronto business calendar. It happened every October, in the same building, with the same catering company, the same string quartet in the corner near the windows. And, Nadine had been told, largely the same people. It was the kind of event where the invitations came on thick cream paper, and where the guest list was quietly curated to reflect a particular version of Canadian business success. Old names, established firms, the kind of wealth that had been accumulating long enough to seem natural rather than earned. NovaSpark Capital had not been invited last year, or the year before. This year, Nadine had been personally contacted by the club's events director, who had explained in careful, enthusiastic language that the committee had voted unanimously to extend an invitation, and that they very much hoped she would attend, given the significance of the proposed partnership under discussion. The proposed partnership was a $900 million infrastructure and technology integration contract, the largest in the club's history of brokered deals, and it involved two of the oldest family firms in Ontario's business community. The Alderton Group had been building commercial real estate and transportation logistics since Nadine's grandmother was still in Lagos. Pemberton Consolidated had been in insurance and financial services since before Confederation, more or less. Both firms were in trouble. Not public trouble, not yet, but the kind of private trouble that serious people recognized when they sat across from the quarterly numbers and did the math without looking away. NovaSpark Capital was not in trouble. NovaSpark Capital, which Nadine Achebe had started in a 2-bedroom apartment in Scarborough, with a laptop that had a cracked hinge and a business plan she'd revised 47 times, had turned 11 years of focused, unglamorous work into one of the most consistently profitable mid-sized tech and infrastructure investment firms in the country. They had not been in the news often. Nadine had not wanted them to be. They had been in the right boardrooms, however, at the right moments, and the results of that were visible in a way that didn't require press coverage to communicate. The woman at the reception desk looked up. "Mrs. Achebe, I'm so sorry for the delay. We have you right here. Welcome to the Harborview Club." Nadine smiled, not warmly, but adequately, and walked inside. The Alderton family arrived 11 minutes after Nadine did. She was standing near the windows with a glass of sparkling water when she heard them come in. The room changed when they arrived. The way a room changes when people who expect to be noticed walk into it. There were 4 of them. Harold Alderton, who was 71, and who moved with the deliberate care of a man who had learned to make slowness look like authority. His son, Graham, who was 44 and carried his father's bone structure without his father's stillness. Graham's wife, Estelle, who was wearing a cream-colored dress and a smile that Nadine recognized immediately as the particular smile of a woman who had spent decades performing pleasantness as a form of social control. And Graham's sister, Pippa, who was on her phone and did not appear to be paying attention to anything else. Nadine watched them work the railroad. Harold shook hands with two men near the bar, who looked genuinely delighted to see him. Graham circulated with practiced ease, touching shoulders, laughing at the right moments. Estelle moved alongside her husband and slightly behind him, never quite beside, and every few seconds she let her eyes travel across the room in that slow, calibrating way that had nothing to do with seeing and everything to do with sorting. Nadine had encountered this type before. She had grown up around people who had nothing, which had taught her a specific kind of literacy for people who had everything and were quietly terrified of losing it. She turned back to the window. Outside, the lake was dark and the lights of the city reflected in pieces across the water. She had a meeting with Harold Alderton scheduled for the following Tuesday. The gala was, in theory, a social occasion, not a business one. She had come because she'd been asked to come, and because showing up mattered in these circles in ways that were difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. She did not expect anything to happen. That was the first mistake she allowed herself that evening. Estelle Alderton appeared at her left shoulder. Approximately 30 minutes later, while Nadine was in the middle of a conversation with a woman from the Ontario Infrastructure Commission who had been describing, with genuine enthusiasm, a new approach to municipal broadband access in the North. Nadine had been listening carefully because the topic was relevant to two of NovaSpark's current projects, and because the woman from the OIC was clearly knowledgeable and had specific things to say. She became aware of Estelle's presence the way you become aware of weather before it fully arrives. "Excuse me." Estelle's voice was pleasant and precise, directed not at Nadine but at the woman from the OIC. "I wonder if I could borrow the—" She paused. The pause lasted perhaps 2 seconds. "The catering staff. We've been waiting for the salmon course for some time." The woman from the OIC blinked. Nadine turned and looked at Estelle Alderton directly. Estelle was looking at her with an expression of perfect, practiced patience, the expression of someone who was certain they were speaking to the right person and was waiting for that person to respond correctly. "I'm not with the catering staff," Nadine said. Something moved behind Estelle's eyes. Not embarrassment, not quite. "Oh," she said. "I apologize. You just—" She gestured, vaguely at nothing. "Well, I'm sorry." The woman from the OIC looked at Nadine. Nadine looked at Estelle. Estelle had already turned away, her attention drifting toward the far end of the room, as if the conversation had concluded to everyone's satisfaction. It had not. But Nadine returned to her conversation with the woman from the OIC, because there was no version of the next seconds that served her better than continuing to talk about municipal broadband. She had a meeting on Tuesday. She had work to do. She had, if she was honest with herself, been through considerably worse than this, in considerably less forgiving rooms, with considerably less leverage on her side of the table. She let it go. She was good at letting things go. She had built a company on knowing which things to hold and which things to release, and she had learned, the hard way, the only way, that the things that feel most necessary to confront are often the ones most designed to distract you. She let it go. But the evening was not finished with her yet. The salmon course arrived. The room settled into the particular rhythm of a formal dinner, quieter, more contained, arranged by table. Nadine had been seated at a table near the center of the room with 3 partners from a Bay Street law firm, a woman who ran a mid-size logistics company out of Hamilton, and an architect who had been involved in the new waterfront development project and who spoke at length about embodied carbon in construction materials in a way that Nadine found genuinely interesting. Graham Alderton was at the adjacent table. She could see him from where she sat, close enough to be aware of him, far enough that the awareness required no action. Halfway through the main course, The man to Graham's left said something that made the table laugh. Nadine wasn't paying close attention. She was listening to the architect. And then, in the particular way that certain sounds cut through ambient noise, not because they're louder, but because of what they carry, she heard Estelle Alderton's voice from somewhere behind her left shoulder. Graham, that's her. That's the one I told you about. The one who was, and then, lower, not low enough. I don't know why they invited someone like that. This isn't that kind of event. The architect was still talking. Nadine picked up her water glass and set it down. The lawyer to her left had not appeared to hear. The woman from Hamilton was looking at her bread plate. Nadine breathed. She had a specific practice for moments like this, a thing she had developed over years, not a meditation technique, nothing she'd read in a book, just a private internal process that she'd arrived at through repetition. She named what was happening. Not to anyone else, just to herself, clearly, without softening it. That was a racial contempt. That happened. It happened here, in this room, in front of these people. She named it, and she held it for exactly as long as it took to become a fact rather than a wound. And then she made a decision about what to do with it. The decision she made was to finish her dinner. She finished her dinner. She contributed to the conversation about embodied carbon. She spoke briefly with the logistics woman about supply chain infrastructure in Northern Ontario. She did all of this while the fact she had named sat in her chest like a stone, and she did not put it down, because putting it down would have required pretending it wasn't there, and Nadine Achebe did not deal in pretending. After dinner, the room moved into a more open configuration. Tables cleared, people circulating again, the string quartet resuming. Harold Alderton crossed the room toward her. He was, in person, exactly what his reputation suggested. A man who had spent 70 years learning how to make other people feel that being in his presence was a privilege. He was warm without being familiar, impressive without being intimidating, and he had the particular skill of making eye contact that seemed to mean something while revealing nothing. Mrs. Achebe, he said, and the way he said it communicated that he knew exactly who she was, had known all evening, and had chosen this moment deliberately. Mr. Alderton, I've been looking forward to Tuesday, as have I. He smiled off. It was a genuine smile, she could tell, because she'd spent a long time learning the difference. I won't talk business tonight. That's a rule of mine at these things. But I want you to know that I've reviewed what your team sent over, and I think there's a real conversation to be had. I think so too. He nodded, looked at her for a moment in a way that suggested he was about to say something that had weight. You've built something remarkable. I mean that without qualification. Thank you, she said. It took a while. He laughed, a real laugh, brief and unperformed. Most things worth building do. He moved on. Nadine stood with her water glass and watched him go, and felt the stone in her chest, and the warmth of his words. In the same moment, both real, neither canceling the other out. Graham Alderton appeared at her elbow, 7 minutes later. He was not his father. He had the same height, the same coloring, the same general architecture, but where Harold's manner was finished and settled, Graham's was effortful in a way that showed around the edges. He had clearly had a few drinks. Not too many, he was not sloppy, but enough that his social calibration had slipped slightly from its daytime precision. Mrs. Achebe, he said, I've been meaning to come and say hello all night. Hello. We're very excited about Tuesday. Good. He seemed momentarily thrown by the brevity of her responses, then recovered. My father thinks very highly of your firm. As do I. I just want you to know, whatever Estelle said earlier, that's not. She didn't mean anything by it. Nadine looked at him. She can be. He made a gesture. Socially. Sometimes she says things without. Mr. Alderton, Nadine said. Graham, please. Mr. Alderton, I appreciate you saying something, but I'd like to be direct with you. Your wife's comments were clear. I understood them exactly as they were meant. An apology on her behalf, offered after dinner, while I'm still standing in this room, doesn't address what they were. Graham's face did the thing that faces do when a conversation has taken a turn the speaker wasn't prepared for. His jaw shifted. His eyes moved briefly to the right and back. Right, he said. Right. I understand. I'll see you Tuesday, she said. She turned and crossed the room toward the exit. In the car on the way home, a black SUV she used on evenings when she needed the time to think without having to navigate anything. Nadine took out her phone and opened a document she used for exactly this kind of accounting. Not a diary, not a record of grievances. A working document, practical in structure, where she noted things that required decisions. She typed, Estelle Alderton, 2 incidents, pattern, consider. She looked at it for a moment. Then she typed, Tuesday, review terms. Consider whether the structure of this deal protects NovaSpark adequately if the personal dynamics within the Alderton family are a long-term liability. She put the phone down, watched the city pass outside the window. The lit intersections, the late-night foot traffic on Queen Street, the particular quality of Toronto at 11 on a weeknight, which had always felt to her like the city at its most honest. Busy, but not performing. She had come from this city. A specific part of it that the people in that room tonight had not come from and had, she suspected, rarely visited. A part where the buildings were shorter, and the grocery stores were smaller, and the buses were always full, and the nights were loud with the ordinary noise of people living their lives in close proximity to other people who were also just living their lives. She had not come from nowhere. She had come from somewhere specific, and she carried it with her always, not as a wound and not as a credential, but simply as a fact about herself. The way all facts about yourself are simply facts. True, formative, non-negotiable. She had left Scarborough at 18 with a scholarship to Waterloo and a single duffel bag that her mother had packed with a careful attention to what would be needed that Nadine only fully understood later, when she had a better frame of reference for what it meant to send your child into a world you'd never had access to yourself, and to do it with love, so disciplined. It looked like practicality. She had called her mother from the car, before the driver arrived, standing outside the Harborview Club in the October cold. How was it? Her mother had asked. Fine, Nadine had said. Typical. Her mother had known what that meant. She always did. Come for Sunday dinner, her mother had said. I'm making rice and stew. I'll be there. She put the phone in her bag and looked out the window and thought about Tuesday. The meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning at the Alderton Group's offices in the financial district, a building that had been there, in various configurations, since the early 1980s, and that communicated through every detail of its lobby, its elevator paneling, its reception furniture, its view, exactly the message it intended to. We have been here a long time. We expect to be here a long time more. Nadine arrived at 8:52 with her CFO, a man named Derek O.C. Frempong, who had been with NovaSpark for 6 years, and who had the specific quality of being both very good at his job and very difficult to rattle. She had hired him partly for the first reason and partly for the second. Some rooms required both. The receptionist, a young man in a dark suit, greeted them by name, offered coffee, and showed them to a boardroom on the 23rd floor. The view was southeast, over the lake. Nadine stood at the windows while Derek reviewed the term sheet on his tablet, and she thought about the stone she had carried home from the Gala 2 nights ago, and the decision she had arrived at somewhere between Sunday dinner and Monday morning. Harold Alderton came in at 9 exactly, with Graham behind him and a woman Nadine recognized as the firm's general counsel, whose name was Patricia Marsh and who had a reputation for precision that Nadine respected. They shook hands. They sat down. Harold said, I'd like to start by saying that I hope Saturday evening was. It was fine, Nadine said. Thank you for having me. He looked at her for a moment. Good. They moved into the agenda. The deal, as structured, was a 10-year partnership. NovaSpark would provide the capital and the technology infrastructure framework. The Alderton Group and Pemberton Consolidated would contribute the real estate portfolio and the regulatory relationships. The revenue split was, on paper, equitable. The governance structure was where the complications lived, as governance structures usually do. Specifically, The proposed agreement included a clause that gave the Alderton Group veto power over major technology decisions in recognition of, and here the legal language was doing quite a lot of work, the partners' long-standing familiarity with the sector's operational requirements. Nadine had read this clause 7 times before the meeting. She had discussed it with Derek. She had discussed it with NovaSpark's own general counsel. She had thought about it, specifically, on Sunday evening after her mother's rice and stew, while she was washing up and her mother was watching the news in the other room, and the apartment smelled the way it had always smelled, and she felt both very far from the gala and very close to the things she needed to understand clearly before Tuesday. The thing she needed to understand was this. Was this deal, as structured, something that NovaSpark was entering as an equal partner? Or was it something that NovaSpark was entering as a service provider, given the aesthetic vocabulary of a partner? She knew the answer. She had known it since she read the clause for the 3rd time. I want to talk about Section 4.7, she said. Patricia Marsh's attention sharpened visibly. Harold Alderton's did not change, which told her something. The veto clause, Nadine said. I'd like to understand the committee's reasoning, Graham said. It's fairly standard in partnerships of this. It's not standard in partnerships of this scale, where one party is providing the primary technical infrastructure, Nadine said. It would be standard if NovaSpark were a subcontractor. We're not a subcontractor. A silence. Harold Alderton said, What would you propose? A joint technical committee. Decisions require consensus. If consensus isn't reached within 30 days, the matter goes to independent arbitration. That significantly slows. It ensures that NovaSpark's technical judgment is not overridden by people who, with respect, are not technical experts, Nadine said. Which is not a criticism of your team. It's a description of the situation. My firm is bringing $900 million and 12 years of infrastructure technology expertise to this table. The governance structure needs to reflect that. Graham was looking at his father. Harold Alderton was looking at Nadine. Patricia Marsh was writing something on her notepad. The silence lasted long enough to be a thing in the room. Then Harold said, Patricia, what's your read? Patricia said, I think Ms. Achebe's position is reasonable. I'd like to take it back to the committee, but I don't see a structural obstacle. Harold nodded. Slowly. The nod of a man who was recalibrating and who was experienced enough to do it without losing composure. All right, he said. Let's talk about what the joint committee would look like. They talked for 2 more hours. At the end of that time, the outline of a revised term sheet existed. Not finalized, not signed, but substantially different from what had been on the table at 8:52 that morning, and different in ways that would matter for 10 years. As they were gathering their things, Harold Alderton said, I want to. He paused, looked at the table for a moment. I want to apologize for anything at the gala that may have been unwelcoming. Nadine looked at him. He was meeting her eyes. I'm aware, he said, that my family does not always. He stopped, started again. I want you to know that what was said does not reflect my view of this partnership or of you. Nadine thought about what Graham had said 2 nights ago, standing at her elbow, slightly too many drinks in. She didn't mean anything by it, and she thought about the distance between that sentence and the one Harold had just said, and the distance was significant and worth noting. I appreciate that, she said. I do, but I want to be honest with you. As someone I hope to be in a 10-year business relationship with. Those things don't go unnoticed. They have consequences. Not because I choose to hold grudges. I don't. But because the way a partner's family behaves in a room tells you something real about the values of the organization. I'll tell you clearly that what happened Saturday is something I weighed seriously before coming today. Harold Alderton was quiet for a moment. That's fair, he said. I know it is, she said. She picked up her bag. Derek was already near the door. She extended her hand. Harold shook it, and she walked out of the boardroom and into the elevator and stood in the small steel box with the 23rd floor number lit above the door and felt, not triumph, exactly. Something quieter. Something that didn't require a name. The revised agreement was circulated 2 weeks later. NovaSpark's legal team reviewed it. Nadine reviewed it. The Joint Technical Committee clause was there, with language that said exactly what she had asked it to say. The governance structure was equitable. The revenue split held. The 10-year framework was intact. She signed on a Thursday afternoon, in her own office, with the view of the lake that she had chosen deliberately when she'd leased this space 4 years ago. The same lake she'd looked out at through the Harborview Club windows while Estelle Alderton recalibrated, and Graham Alderton made apologies that belonged to someone else. She signed with a pen her mother had given her when NovaSpark closed its Series A round 11 years ago. A simple pen, not expensive, purchased because her mother had seen it in a shop window and thought it looked like the kind of pen a serious person would use. Nadine had used it to sign every significant document since. Derek brought champagne. They drank it, the two of them, at the conference table, and then they had a full team call to walk through the implementation timeline, and then they went back to work. That evening, Nadine went home to her apartment in the West End. Not Scarborough, not anymore, but not far, and she had bought the building 2 years ago for reasons that were partly financial and partly something she didn't fully explain to anyone. She made tea. She stood at her own windows. A different lake view, a quieter one. And she thought about the woman who had stood at the entrance of the Harborview Club in the October wind and been told, in the language of automatic assumption, that she had come to the wrong door. She had not come to the wrong door. She had never come to the wrong door. The door had simply been designed by people who had not imagined her on the other side of it. And that was their failure of imagination, not a fact about where she belonged. She had spent 38 years building a life in the space between other people's assumptions and the truth. The gap was uncomfortable to live in. It was also, she had come to understand, where most of the real work happened. The work that didn't get written up in the business press. The work that didn't translate into sound bites or keynote talks. The work of simply continuing, clearly and without apology, to exist as the person she was in every room she entered, regardless of what that room had been designed to communicate about who was welcome in it. The lake was dark. The city lights moved across it in pieces. She finished her tea. She had 3 meetings tomorrow, a board call on Friday, and a proposal to review for a new infrastructure project in Northern Ontario that had been sitting in her inbox for 4 days, and that she had a feeling, based on what she'd heard from the woman at the Gala from the Infrastructure Commission, was worth taking seriously. She rinsed her mug and put it in the rack and went to her desk and opened her laptop. There was more to build. There always was. That was not a burden. It had never been a burden. It was, and had always been, the whole point.